Enjoy this tour of one of the scariest U.S. cases. Today, we'll discuss 1904 events that shook the Midwest. Illinois was changing at the time. Leave a comment with your viewing location before we begin. We want to hear from anyone following this story. Illinois was very different in the early 1900s. Although Chicago was a bustling industrial city full of immigrants and although the economy was good, the state's interior maintained its rural rhythm, almost forgotten by the big city's rapid progress. People in small farming towns across central Illinois counties lived a simple life that seems unreal today. Dirt roads cross endless corn and wheat fields. Some families were longtime friends. The seasons affected daily life, and secrets were kept hidden. Everything seemed calm, but then something strange happened. Sangamon County had productive farmland and hardworking people. Central Illinois was the location. Springfield, the state capital, was there, but we want a remote area with miles of farms and no neighbors. The Midwest was cold and snowy in 1904. Early evening darkness seemed to cover everything. Small, flickering lights were in some kerosene lanterns. January was bitterly cold. Locals were used to harsh winters, but this one was worse. Roads were impassable for days after snowfall. It was alone. Farmers stood alone in a vast, empty sea. In this type of community, neighbors relied on each other and noticed if a neighbor missed a church service or town event. Farmer Thomas died January 15th. Brennan noticed something odd. On his horse, he saw something strange on the road from his property to Mechanicsburg. The well-known Hartley family should have had chimney smoke. However, nothing was seen. On that cold morning, with temperatures around minus 20 degrees, there was no fire, which was odd. It could have killed. Thomas knew James Hartley for over a decade. James worked hard, a small but productive farm owner in his early 40s. He lived with his quiet, well-liked wife, Margaret. Locals whispered that the couple had no children, but no one dared question it. They worked hard, didn't talk, and attended Village Baptist Church weekly. Thomas pondered it. He knew it was rude to disturb someone in their privacy, but the scene upset him. It appeared the house was empty. No. Wind howled across empty fields with no one there or sound. Walking, he rose. He tied the reins to a fence after getting off the horse. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the front door. He knocked twice, then once. Nothing. He mentioned James and Margaret. No sound. That's when he saw something unsettling. A small crack in the door let cold air in. Thomas slowly opened the door, making rusty hinges clatter, but darkness and cold filled the house. He shook for more than the weather. He called again, and this time his voice echoed through the empty rooms. Something was seriously wrong. Nothing. Thomas entered slowly. The main room was messy, but not from a fight. Different. Some furniture moved, like someone had to leave quickly. Plates with frozen food scraps were on the kitchen table after a chair fell. The hearth was lifeless. The cold ashes showed the fire hadn't been fed in days or weeks. He checked the other rooms. The couple's bedroom bed was unmade, and the blankets were scattered like someone got up quickly. Open drawers and clothes were everywhere. Thomas's heart raced. He searched the house for signs of violence, strange stains, or anything else that could help him figure out what happened to the couple. He only found strange chaos and a cold feeling throughout the house. He inspected the barn and other buildings outside. Without care, all animals died of frostbite. Horses, chickens, and cattle needed to stay warm. My heart broke at that scene. Thomas knew he needed police help. He mounted his horse and rode to Mechanicsburg, where he met Sheriff William Porter. Sheriff Porter was a serious person. He returned to Hartley with men. farm that afternoon. The group searched the property for clues but found more questions than answers. It was unclear why a couple disappeared in the middle of a harsh winter. There were no signs of forced entry or violent crime. Police found a strange item in the barn. Marks in the hardened snow indicated a wagon had been moved recently, possibly days earlier. James and Margaret left everything on a cold night. Where did they go? Why didn't they tell anyone? Mechanicsburg was small. Everyone knew each other. Especially now that it's dangerous, a trip would be known. Sheriff Porter questioned the nearest neighbors. Most people hadn't seen the Hartleys in 10 days. James's last conversation was with the Mechanicsburg general store owner. A short conversation about seeds for the coming season came to mind. Nothing unusual. James. She seemed worried, but the storekeeper said it was just winter issues. Her last trip to town was longer. Several churchwomen have noted her social withdrawal in recent weeks, but no one took it seriously. Over the next few days, nearby counties learned of Hartley's disappearance. Local newspapers requested information in short articles. Springfield Journal published a half-page mystery feature. Describe the couple and request that anyone with information call the police. Nothing came of it. In that cold January, James and Margaret Hartley seemed delusional. Details were found that made the case even stranger when investigated. Sheriff Porter searched the Hartley home's remaining items more thoroughly. Papers and documents filled James' drawer. He found letters with a different meaning in one. The couple's life seems straightforward. People from different states wrote letters. Financial records show non-farming businesses and notebook entries list unknown names. A letter caught the sheriff's eye. It was from November 1903, 2 months before the person disappeared. It was sent from St. Louis, Missouri, and signed with initials that made identification difficult. Though unclear, the content had a tone. Have to. That it mentioned a must-attend opportunity and a winter meeting. Sender told James to keep everything secret, even from Margaret. This discovery shifted the investigation significantly. Porter began to suspect the disappearance was intentional. James Hartley may have left quickly due to a shady situation. It wasn't clear why Margaret had also disappeared, or why they left everything, including their savings, which were found in a tin can during the search. St. Louis police received telegrams from the sheriff asking them to find any Hartley family ties. The answer arrived almost 2 weeks late due to communication issues. It brought bad news when it arrived. There were records of James Hartley. Had city business disputes years ago, but nothing clear. It seemed the case circled continually. In a small town near Mechanicsburg, rumors spread. Unanswered questions increased guesswork. Nearby neighbors reported seeing strange people weeks before the person disappeared. One December night, a farmer heard loud voices from Hartley's land but didn't believe them. Someone in the neighborhood saw an unfamiliar. A wagon pulled along the main road to the couple's farm at dusk. Winter made wide searches difficult. The authorities recruited volunteers to search the rural property's dense woods. The snow covered everything, so they couldn't see any signs that the couple tried to walk, but gave up in the cold. People checked frozen streams because they thought something bad happened. Nothing was found. A new lead emerged in February after the weather warmed. A horse trader who traveled between Springfield and Decca saw a couple resembling Hartley at an inn in Decca in late January. An unknown younger man was with them, he said. 3 people arrived quickly, paid cash, and left the next morning for the south. Sheriff Porter and 2 deputies immediately went to Decatur. The town in Mon County had more residents then. Mechanicsburg was connected to larger cities by this hub. The merchant said the inn was near the train station, a busy place with strange people that was easy to miss. Edmund Price, the old innkeeper, confirmed it. He remembered the couple because the woman looked tense and scared. She didn't talk much during their stay. Edmund thought James was the older man who planned and paid in advance. The third person, a young man, waited outside while the rooms were set up. Edmund said this man was in his early 20s and wore simple travel clothes. Edmund said something important to the sheriff at night. He heard the couple's room voices. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone evoked a fight. She was sad. She hid her eyes when they left downstairs in the morning. Remained silent. Edmund thought it odd, but didn't like getting involved in others' lives. He knew not to ask because everyone on the road had problems. The police chief asked Edmund where the three went. The innkeeper said they mentioned taking the train but didn't say where. Lines ran in many directions at Dacre, between Chicago and St. Louis to the north, and Indianapolis and Chicago to the east, not knowing which train. The couple was hard to find because no one knew their route or if they boarded. Porter spoke to train station workers during the period in question. The ticket agent remembered selling tickets to a small group that morning, but not where or what they were for. Many people passed through the station daily. Many travelers bought tickets under false names, making specific records unlikely. They weren't registered properly. Decatur's leadership caused more harm than good. If the Hartleys were at the inn, they were alive and fleeing. But who was the third man? Why did Margaret look so upset? The sheriff considered worst-case scenarios. Maybe the couple left everything because of a threat. After returning to Mechanicsburg, Porter informed everyone of his findings. Many hypotheses existed. James was accused of collaborating with criminals and paying the price. He may have escaped because he was having an affair. Some believed Margaret had a mental illness that caused her to act irrationally and bring James down. Each explanation was good, but not perfect. Springfield Journal published a longer case article in March. It included pictures based on Hartley's descriptions and requested information again. With contact info. Article interest spread to several Illinois cities and nearby states. A few people reported seeing something, but all were false alarms. It was cold on Hartley's trail. As spring approached, the case lost attention. Life continued as usual as the news covered other stories. For those present, especially Sheriff Porter and the couple's close friends and family, I kept coming back to the mystery, friends. No crops were planted on the Hartley farm, and the empty house seemed to have seen something no one could explain. Thor and a discovery in spring 1904 revived the case unexpectedly. When the creeks and streams reopened in autumn after months of freezing, some fishermen saw something strange on the Sangamon River about 10 miles from the empty Hartley farm. It, a wet suitcase partially buried in mud, could only be seen because spring floodwaters had changed the riverbank. The small town of Athens fishermen took the suitcase to the sheriff's office, where William Porter was immediately called. Opened suitcase contents amazed everyone. All women's clothes are high quality, and some have Springfield store tags. A small case held simple but valuable jewelry. Many Mechanicsburg women recognized Margaret Hartley's brooch. She wore her mother's wedding dress to church every Sunday. The discovery raised concerns. Why would Margaret leave such valuables if the couple was fleeing? Visitors to the Decatur asked. Was it wise to leave things as they were? The biggest question is how this suitcase got on the Sangamon River so far from the route. They probably took to reach Dacre. Porter intensified his river search. Dozens of volunteers searched the banks for evidence or bodies that might have washed away for days. The search continued miles down the river past Athens to where the Sangamon met more people. Nothing else was found. Like a lost puzzle piece, the suitcase remained a mystery. Sheriff chose to review the case from scratch. Back at the Hartley farmhouse, covered in early spring plants, he searched more carefully. One of his deputies found something new while investigating it again. House basement stone wall had a hole. Behind dusty canned goods shelves, a diary was wrapped in oilcloth to keep water out. In her diary, Margaret wrote. Writing began. In 1901 and intermittently until December 1903, a few weeks before she disappeared. The small but clear writing depicted a woman who was unlike anyone else. Margaret wrote about her loneliness and the difficulty of living alone. She wrote about secrets she couldn't share. Margaret wrote in her September 1903 diary that she and James often fought over money. He did business in ways she didn't like, but she didn't know. Explain your point. She described non-local men who arrived at the farm late at night and left before dawn. She wrote with increasing fear because she knew something bad was coming. The diary's final entry, on December 18, 1903, was especially upsetting. Margaret wrote quickly, making some words unreadable. She discussed a life-changing decision James made without asking her. She wrote about an afternoon visitor from. Her husband looked upset when she told him about James's past. Margaret feared they were getting stuck. She felt like she was cut off when the entry ended abruptly. Porter read the diary several times in Mechanicsburg to learn everything he could. Margaret's words described a couple whose relationship was deteriorating and who were hiding parts of their lives. What did James do? Who were? These nighttime visitors? The man mentioned in the last entry was who? Sheriff wanted to know James Hartley's past. Before that, everyone thought he was a normal farmer who moved to Illinois years earlier. Where exactly? Porter wrote to nearby counties and states to find any James Hartleys who matched the missing man's description. In May, responses began, and they showed. Was unexpected. Henderson County, Kentucky, records showed a James Hartley plot to steal money in 1897. James left before the police could question him about scam investments that had harmed several families. Though the physical description was close, it was impossible to confirm that it was the same person. Porter also learned from Indiana that a man with the same name was arrested. They were investigated for cross-state smuggling in 1899. This time, the suspect fled before being charged. There were too many coincidences to ignore. Mechanicsburg residents were increasingly suspicious of James Hartley. He was a bad guy whose past caught up with him. This new information altered the case. James would act secretly if he was fleeing past crimes, doing business with suspicious visitors. His past may have caught up with him in January. The Margaret issue persisted. Was she a partner or victim? The diary suggested she didn't know about many of James's activities. Sheriff Porter found James and Margaret's 1898 Springfield marriage in the county's marriage records. They disappeared from Illinois records soon after arriving. Margaret married and became Margaret Mitchell. Porter discovered her family in a small Ohio town. He wrote the government there for Mitchell family information. Answering increased the mystery. According to the Mitchell family, Margaret left for the West in 1897 after her parents died. She wrote that she had met a man and planned to marry him, but they stopped writing. Her last letter to her sister was from 1899. Margaret smiled as she talked about her farm life and future plans. No danger was apparent. Then what changed? How did a happy woman in 1899 become so afraid and hopeless in 1903, as her diary entries show? 4 years had passed, enough time for secrets to emerge and hopes to be dashed. Margaret discovered something terrifying about James that she couldn't escape. Porter began to make order of events. James moved to Illinois in 1897 or 1898, possibly to escape Kentucky trouble. Having lost her parents, Margaret was weak when he married her. They hid on the Mechanicsburg farm. For a while, all was well. A glimpse of James's past appeared in 1902 or 1903. Visitors arrived at night. Uncertain deals were made. Margaret learned disturbing facts. Some event in December 1903 sparks. Trouble. James receives news or demands from his past. There may have been threats. James may be enslaved by debt or a situation. The couple must make a terrible choice. Around January 1904, they leave quickly, leaving everything. The young man from Dakota is their third man. Police Chief Porter's theory was developing, but there were still major gaps. Any issues with the suitcase? In the river was unknown. Why did they throw away Margaret's valuables without thinking if they were running away? Why did they choose the Sangamon River, which went the wrong way to Dakar? This seemed like more than an escape. An unexpected witness appeared in June 1904. A railroad worker who had been sick for months contacted Sheriff Porter after reading about the case in the newspaper. Robert Hayes maintained the lines crossed Sangamon County. He described what he saw on a cold January night around January 12th or 13th. He couldn't pinpoint the date. Robert saw a wagon next to a remote railroad track near Clear Lake while exploring. After 9 p.m., it was cold and late. What interested him was the wagon passenger's behavior. 3 people, 1 woman, 2 men, and 1 woman. As one man appeared upset, nervously waving his arms and staring at the tracks as if waiting. Woman sat with arms around her on wagon back. Robert couldn't see her face because it was dark and far away, but he noticed she wasn't moving despite the cold. Second younger man kept horses calm. Robert considered helping, but the scene unnerved him. There was tension. It felt like he wasn't welcome. He looked around and returned the same way an hour later to find the wagon gone. Robert thought about what happened for a few days, but forgot. He thought it was a winter commuter having a bad time. His realization that these people might be the missing couple came months later after reading about the Hartley case. Robert Hayes's tale introduced. The mystery deepens. The main road to Dakar didn't pass Clear Lake, which was between Mechanicsburg and the Sangamon River. Nighttime waiting near the tracks was wrong. Porter considered several options. Maybe they were waiting for a freight train to stop in this remote area. This would let them travel undetected. Maybe they were meeting a train passenger. Sheriff inspected Clear Lake for himself. Uninhabited fields and small forest surrounded them. On a lonely path, the railroad rarely carried people in that area. Goods and agricultural products were transported by freight trains between larger cities. It looked like a place a secretive person would meet. Porter spoke to railroad workers and locals. Rumors emerged, but were never confirmed that some. Not all freight trains carried legal goods. They transported stolen goods and people trying to travel without paying or being caught. Though rare, it wasn't unusual at the time. This new information opened up intriguing possibilities. Considering his past criminal activity, James Hartley may know people who could help him arrange secret transportation for the young man seen with him. The couple could help them board the plane safely and undetected. This would explain their later appearance in Clear Lake and Dakar. To avoid detection, they may have taken different routes. The Riverside suitcase didn't fit that story. Porter re-examined the evidence. The bag contained Margaret's clothes and jewelry, but not James's. Thus, it may not have. Intentionally discarded, not accidentally or in a panic. Someone wanted those items found or was ready to get rid of them. The sheriff considered a bad scenario. What if Margaret didn't want to travel? Witnesses described her as tense, scared, and quiet. Robert Hayes noticed that she didn't move in the wagon while blanketed, despite the cold. Is she being held against her will? Maybe James, who was desperate and stressed from his, due to past issues, did something terrible. After thinking this way, Porter reread Margaret's diary. The last entries showed that her fear was growing, that she felt pulled into something terrible, and that James had made decisions without her input. Margaret never wrote that she was in danger, but her pain was obvious. Perhaps she knew she couldn't escape, that she was trapped in a situation she didn't understand. Equally hazardous. Porter received an unexpected letter in July. A Springfield lawyer who represents Hartley Estate stakeholders sent it. James never paid back the loan for the farm because the couple was missing and no payments were made. Bank sued to reclaim land. New information about Hartley's location would affect the case, so the lawyer wanted to know. Information about money. Added another puzzle piece. James may have been broke and needed money. At least that would explain his shady business and his nighttime visitors that Margaret was afraid of. James's money problems may have been the start of his illegal activities. Porter asked the bank for records and found that James had withdrawn almost all of his savings in December 1903. Some. Days later, a large deposit was left, much more than a farmer would leave. No one knew where the money came from. It didn't match livestock or crop sales. Who gave James that much money, and why did they hide their other savings in the barn? Financial transactions suggested December was a big month. James had money, which may have been related to Margaret's shady business in her diary, but this money had a catch. It could have been payment for James's job. Another possibility is that he left quickly for a previous offense. In summer 1904, the sheriff tried to piece together this information. He had a story idea. Before moving to Illinois, James Hartley was in trouble with the law and pretended to be good. Margaret didn't know his secrets at first, learned the truth about her husband. After 1903, James's past caught up. He got into difficult situations because of dangerous people. James had to act in winter 1904. He collected his money, made plans with people who could help him disappear, and left with Margaret despite her objections. Instead of main roads and official routes, they traveled secret routes in wagons and freight trains. Stations. Margaret lost her belongings before or during the trip. They ended up in the river for unknown reasons. It fit many known facts, but some things didn't make sense. Margaret's behavior clue. If she was forced, why didn't she ask the innkeeper for help? Why didn't she flee? Maybe her young friend was watching her. Or, despite her fear, she may have loved or hoped for James. Fall brought an unexpected turn to the case. Cairo, a port city on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in southern Illinois, telegraphed Sheriff Porter an important message in September 1904. Short but shocking text. A woman walked on the docks. She was lost and couldn't identify herself. The description fit Margaret's body. Bradley. Porter left immediately for Cairo, a 2-day trip due to rail connections. The city was a hub for traders and travelers. Rivers carried people and goods throughout the city. You could easily get lost in the city's crowds of dock workers, sailors, and tourists. Porter arrived at the Cairo sheriff's office and was taken to a small hospital. She was closely monitored. His belief was confirmed when he saw her. However, the woman in front of him was nothing like the Margaret Hartley Mechanicsburg residents knew. She always tied her hair back, but now it was messy and cut unevenly. Instead of her usual simple, well-kept dresses, her clothes looked worn. She was there, but her eyes made her seem far away. Porter rose too, presenting himself calmly. Margaret saw him but didn't recognize him. Mechanicsburg, the farm, and neighbors were his topics. Something returned to her memory over time. Her shaking and tears began. The sheriff advised her to take her time and reflect. Last, she whispered her name inaudibly. They hadn't seen her awake since she was found days earlier. The nearby. Margaret's doctor told Porter she was mentally and physically exhausted. She was malnourished and looked like she had been there for a while. No serious injuries were present, but her mental state was scary. She alternated between being still and shaking and mumbling about rivers, travels, and places the doctor couldn't identify. Porter spent several days in Cairo and visited Margaret daily, trying with all her patience to find out what happened since January. Progress was slow and erratic. Margaret had trouble organizing her thoughts. Her scattered memories organized things that didn't make sense. Eventually, a story emerged. She confirmed that they left the farm in January. Her voice shook as she said James was desperate. On the farm were men. In recent weeks, men have made demands James couldn't refuse. He owed Margaret a lot for business deals she didn't understand. James requested more time, but these people were not patient or kind. The night before they left was a mess. James woke her up late and urgently told her to leave. There wasn't time for explanations or proper packing. He packed some clothes and left the house quickly. Young man prepared for someone with a cart, and James offered to help. Margaret was scared and didn't understand what was happening, but her husband's eyes showed he was scared. No main roads were taken during the cold night. Margaret remembered the cold, her constant fear, and her feeling of being chased. They stopped by the tracks. The place Robert Hayes had mentioned months earlier was familiar to her. They stood for hours. James kept looking around while the young man held the horses. Finally, a freight train slowed enough for them to board an empty car. Margaret described the train ride as a persistent nightmare. The carriage had no heat or comfort, so it was freezing. They traveled for hours or days. She doubted. James pushed her off the train when it stopped. She discovered they were near Decatur. It was. She lost her suitcase in the noise at the stop. Margaret forgot the details. She remembered that moment vaguely. Young man and James fought over something. They spoke loudly but softly. The bag wasn't brought. She knew it, but couldn't explain why. Might have been too heavy. James might have feared too much attention. That bag was lost in the river for reasons Margaret didn't understand. Edmund Price promised they would stay at the inn that night. Margaret remembered being too tired to comprehend what was happening. James and the boy were planning behind her back while speaking softly. They took a morning train. This time, they were regular passengers with fake names. Margaret was shocked when James had fake papers. How many things did her husband hide? They traveled, traveling south through towns. Margaret lost her location and time. They sometimes stayed a few days in cheap inns before continuing. James looked for someone or something but never said so. After a few weeks, the young man who had been with them vanished. He left Margaret when she woke up. She and James traveled alone after that without a plan. Her husband was obvious changes. She knew all his secrets, but he was afraid and hopeless. He saw threats everywhere and was wary of anyone who looked at him. As their money ran out, they had to get short-term jobs on farms and in shops along the way. At some point, Margaret couldn't remember when they got to Cairo. The town was very different from Mechanicsburg, which was peaceful and quiet. It was very chaotic and noisy. James told them they had to find a boat that would take them south, bring them down the river, maybe to New Orleans, where they can start over. He was getting more and more upset, sleeping little, and looking over his shoulder all the time. Things really went wrong on one of those nights in Cairo. She woke up by herself in the small room they shared in a guest house close to the docks. James left and said he'd be back in a few hours, but he still wasn't there when morning came. One day she had to wait, and then another. The third morning, she accepted the terrible truth. He had left her behind. Margaret had no money, no one to talk to, and no way to get home. She wasn't even sure if she still had a home to go back to. After months of stress and fear, the shock of realizing this finally broke something inside her. She was lost both physically and mentally as she walked around Cairo's streets. She couldn't remember much about the next few days. People tried to talk to her, but she couldn't make sense of their words. She remembered seeing worried faces. In the end, the sheriff of the area found her because someone took her to the police. Porter listened while feeling both sorry for and angry at the person. Margaret's story filled in a lot of blanks, but it also made me think of new ones. Where was James now? Why did he leave his wife after running away with her for months? Did he hide somewhere in Cairo, or did he get on a boat and head down the river? Who were these people they were running away from? Sheriff investigated Cairo by interviewing with dock workers, boarding house owners, and James Hartley fans. Some had vague memories of a man who fit the description, but no one knew where he was. People constantly came and went from Cairo, a transit town. A lone man could easily disappear. Porter investigated ships leaving Cairo when James disappeared. Several steamships carried passengers and cargo south. Cargo. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Many captains didn't keep comprehensive passenger lists, especially if they paid cash and didn't cause trouble. James could be somewhere along the Mississippi, possibly in Louisiana, or further away. Porter stayed in Cairo for a few more weeks to give Margaret time to recover. She was too weak to travel. He continued to gather more information from her clouded memories. She named cities she remembered from their trips. Porter meticulously recorded everything in hopes of finding James. Porter investigated the clues Margaret left as she recovered. One piece of information caught his eye. Margaret said James received a telegram in a small town south of Dakar that left him visibly shaken, even though although she didn't know the message, she remembered her husband's reaction. He read the telegram several times and burned it in their room's fireplace. Porter visited Marion County's Centria, as Margaret had said. He visited the telegraph office and explained his investigation to get records of telegrams sent and received during the period. Finding it was like finding a needle in a haystack. He eventually did. Found an intriguing entry. February 19, 04. St. Louis telegram to J. Hart. The audio was cryptic but suggestive. Agreement broken. Unsustainable. No return. The message was signed with initials Porter didn't recognize, but the tone was clear. It appeared that something had gone wrong in this communication between shady characters. If this telegram was for James Hartley, it would explain why he became more desperate after receiving it. Sheriff decided to visit St. Louis again. The city was larger and more complex than any other Illinois location he had investigated. Finding specific James Hartley connections was nearly impossible, with hundreds of thousands of residents. Porter persevered and found a starting point: the telegraph office that sent the message. The clerk who answered the messages didn't remember details. However, records showed the telegram's sending address, a commercial district near the river. Porter spent days touring businesses and talking to merchants and residents. He found a clue in a dockworker tavern. The business was owned by German immigrant Hinrich Mueller. James Hartley was remembered by a different name. Heinrich said the man had been to his tavern a few years earlier, but always with others. Heinrich also advised against getting too close to others. These men made shady deals, illegally imported goods, gambled, and gave desperate people high-interest loans. James, whoever he was, valued this group. He owed a lot of money and tried to scam dangerous people, which Heinrich heard. Heinrich didn't understand an argument. Then James just vanished from St. Louis. He met Margaret in Illinois around 1897 or 1898, according to records. The story was coming together. After leaving St. Louis with debts and dangerous enemies, James Hartley settled in Mechanicsburg by pretending to be good. The people he ran from found him after years of hiding his past. The nighttime visitors in Margaret's diary were likely debt collectors or middlemen demanding payment. Old debts must be paid as interest accumulates. Heinrich gave Porter names of people suspected of those shady deals from years ago. Many had died, disappeared, or were imprisoned. However, one name stood out. Dalton, a dangerous man, was in charge of many Port District crimes. James, leaving Illinois quickly to avoid being caught, makes sense if he owed Dalton money. The sheriff couldn't find Dalton, as elusive as a shadow. Though everyone seemed to know him, no one claimed to know him. He used middlemen to hide his identity. Porter knew he was dealing with someone who had carefully built walls around himself, making him nearly inaccessible to police. When October ended, Porter returned to Cairo angry but unbeaten. Margaret was much better both times, both mentally and physically. Her eyes were no longer scared and distant because she had gained weight. She spoke more clearly, but her concerns remained. With caution, the doctor said she was fine to travel. Porter planned her return to Mechanicsburg over several days. Margaret was afraid to return because she didn't know how people would react to her after everything. The sheriff told her people were worried about her and glad she was alive. Most of her neighbors felt sorry for her after hearing she had been kidnapped. After arriving in November, Margaret had mixed feelings about Mechanicsburg. Some people welcomed her back warmly. Some stayed away because they didn't know what happened and thought she knew more about James's business. Yes, she said. Wild plants had grown on the farm while she was gone, making it look abandoned. Margaret didn't want to return home. The secrets and fears of her last few months there made remembering that place too painful. Her church family housed her while she decided what to do next. The foreclosure process continued, and she appeared to lose the land. Porter continued investigating the case for weeks, trying to find James. Police in Mississippi cities received detailed descriptions and were warned to stay alert. He also called deputy sheriffs in New Orleans because he thought James would try to blend in with the diverse residents. December 1904, almost a year after the first disappearance, Porter. A promising New Orleans report. A man who resembled James Hartley was seen in the city's waterfront areas, where he worked as a longshoreman and lived in squalor. A local police officer was intrigued by the case after reading a southern city newspaper. Porter considered visiting New Orleans, but winter weather would have made the trip difficult and slow. Also, legal issues were complex. Illinois didn't want James Hartley for a crime. Since he left his wife in debts, his actions were morally questionable but likely legal. Missouri police may have arrested him, but it would be hard to prove he committed crimes years ago. The sheriff decided to work with New Orleans police to resolve the issue, providing all available information and instructing them to monitor the suspect. If James was there, he would do something wrong to be caught. Although unsure, Porter thought Margaret might need to be told. After months of trauma, she was rebuilding her life and finding peace. She could lose all her progress knowing James was so close. In Mechanicsburg, things continued. 1904 wasn't as cold. The last one benefits farmers and travelers. Margaret helped at a local small school, teaching kids to sew and craft. The job wasn't high-paying, but it gave her purpose and money. She rarely mentioned James or her months on the run. She focused on the present and her uncertain future vision. Watching her progress made Porter happy and worried. He knew, as long as Margaret's life was in danger as long as James was around. Also present were the St. Louis men who had driven James away. If they knew Margaret was back in Illinois, they might use Margaret to get James to come out of hiding if he still cared about her. Unpredictable events occurred in 1905. Porter received bad news from New Orleans in February. The man suspected of James Hartley left. The local police officer investigating said the suspect stopped going to his usual spots. He was last seen on a foggy night near Port District warehouses talking to two unidentified men. After that, no one saw him. The sudden disappearance raised suspicions. New Orleans was a lively and exciting city, but also dangerous. Port districts were managed by rival gangs seeking territory and business. These places saw many disappearances, some intentional and others more sinister. Murky Mississippi River water that flows into the Gulf of Mexico held secrets that would never be revealed. Porter carefully informed Margaret that James may never be found. Her response was confusing. There was relief and hope that maybe. This chapter of her life was over. Her sadness was not due to James's transformation. She felt sad because she had lost the illusion of her life and seen it crumble. Porter heard her say something new. James changed in their last few days in Cairo. Sad resignation replaced his fear and hopelessness. After years of regret, he discussed his mistakes, put him on an unrecoverable path. Margaret realized her husband had given up on leaving his past. He knew it would catch him. The news changed my opinion of Margaret's abandonment. James may have left her to protect her, not out of indifference or cowardice. He would have known the final battle would happen if St. Louis's men were close. He was right to flee her. Trouble-free Margaret. It was a last-ditch effort to make things right and possibly his most selfless act in years. Porter contemplated this while receiving random New Orleans updates. Manhunt for missing man had no clear leads. No body was found, but in that city, the river was a quick way to dispose of evidence. Local authorities closed the case due to other priorities. Getting their attention. Margaret's life changed slowly in Mechanicsburg. The bank repurchased the Hartley farm in March 1905 and sold it to an Ohio family. The new owners cleared the land, demolished damaged buildings, and built new ones. It appeared they were removing the last physical remnants of the area's history. Margaret thought this was good because it would free the land of ghosts. She did it too. Besides that, Margaret added church and community work to her schoolwork. She gradually won over the women who had avoided her. Realizing she'd been hurt by unchangeable things, in whispered conversations her past stories would sometimes resurface, but they faded as new events and daily life took over. Porter persisted with the case, keeping careful records of everything he owned, followed every lead, and investigated every theory. He received useful information occasionally. A man resembling James was seen in a distant city. He meticulously examined all of these reports, but none yielded clear conclusions. Something strange happened in June 1905, reigniting interest in the case. A Mississippi River fisherman near Memphis, Tennessee, found a wallet floating in the water with trash washed up by the river. The stream. Wet papers were nearly unreadable, but a name was visible. Harlem James. The couple looked like James and Margaret in a small photo. Despite water damage, it was recognizable. Porter went to Memphis to inspect the items after the police called. The photo, taken shortly after their 1898 wedding, convinced Margaret that James owned the wallet. How the items entered the river was unknown. They managed. They may have been thrown away to give up their identity or lost in a fight or after a worse event. The discovery garnered media attention. The Hartley case briefly made headlines. After reporters visited Mechanicsburg, Margaret politely declined most of their requests. Porter said little, mostly emphasizing the investigation. Still ongoing, but that the wallet alone didn't provide enough evidence to draw conclusions. Porter also received a Memphis letter without a return address or sender. Though confusing, it made sense. Look for Vicksburg, where the river turns red. Vicksburg, Mississippi, was 150 miles south of Memphis. The river running red may have been a reference to the Civil War, when terrible battles occurred in that area. Porter, considered whether the letter was a hoax to capitalize on the case's newfound interest. However, the message's tone intrigued him. The detail suggested knowledge. He contacted Vicksburg police before making the long drive to investigate. Sheriff Thomas Garrett of Vicksburg helped and cared about the case. He read about the Hartley family in the news and wondered how they were related to his town. Robert contacted locals and business owners to see if anyone matching James' description had been seen. It was surprising how well they responded. Many locals remembered seeing a man who resembled James working in the warehouses near the river earlier this year. He looked like John or James Harrison, despite having a different name. This man rarely appeared, meeting with others, focusing on work, and sleeping in a rented room. Strangely, this man left Vicksburg in late January 1905, around the same time someone went missing in New Orleans. He paid his rent early until the end of the month, but never returned after leaving in the morning. It wasn't worth finding the landlord because he kept some worthless items. Porter examined these carefully. There were worn books and papers with financial calculations on them. Simple clothes. A draft of a letter he never sent to Margaret was intriguing among these papers. Someone with shaking hands or emotional stress wrote it. The fragmented content expressed deep regret and apologies for everything that happened. James wrote about how his choices ruined his and her lives. It was said he had. He tried to escape his past, but failed. He realized some debts were unpayable. The letter ended abruptly, without a signature or closing. He appeared to have been interrupted or given up while finishing. Porter carefully stored the paper because he wasn't sure if Margaret should see it. Porter investigated what James Hartley did in Vicksburg a few weeks ago, which kept the investigation going. Sheriff Garrett was a friend because he knew Vicksburg's social scene. Complexities and dark spots. They visited taverns, gambling dens, and other hiding places for fleeing men. Stories made a shadowy man who always looked over his shoulder more visible. The bartender at a nearby riverfront business remembered James, or John Harrison, well. The man had been to the bar several times, but he always drank alone in a dark corner and never chatted. However, one night he seemed especially upset. Despite staying quiet, the bartender saw that his hands were shaking, and his eyes were jumping around when the door opened because he drank more than usual. Bartender said something important. He last saw James when two men entered the business and recognized him. You could feel the tension without a fight. James then left quickly. He left half his drink in the glass. Both men headed in the same direction after a few minutes. After that night, the bartender never saw them again. Since early February 1905, James had not been in his rented room. Porter tried to learn more about these two men, but got confusing information. Both dressed in plain clothes. They were taller and stockier, but the bartender couldn't say. How lights in the poor, though his business was poor, he served many people daily. He could recall how dangerous these men seemed. They evoked fear and kept sensible people away. Sheriff Garrett suggested these were the St. Louis men who had pursued James. They may have found him in Vicksburg after months of searching. Mississippi was a key way to travel and communicate in the South. Criminals maintained informant networks in several port cities. Persistent and creative hunters would find a hiding man. Porter spent days walking along the river talking to dock workers, riverboat captains, and anyone else who might have seen or heard something important. The Mississippi was wide and muddy at Vicksburg, flowing south. It was clear this river had seen a lot. Over the years, happy, sad, and unknown stories have been told. The comments of an elderly dock worker who had been loading and unloading boats for years were disturbing. He claimed that the river's complicated currents, sudden eddies, and submerged logs would forever hide things. When currents or water levels changed, something that had been gone for months or years would appear downstream. But often, river cargo was lost forever. Porter felt conflicted after this conversation. While part of him wanted clear answers to end the case, another part knew that some stories had no clear endings. James Hartley disappeared into the complicated south of the U.S. when identities were easy to change, and the land was so big that there were many ways to start over or disappear forever. Before leaving Vicksburg, Porter concluded his conversation with Sheriff Garrett. They discussed the case, its likelihood, and the difference between evidence and proof. After 20 years as a police officer, Garrett shared his professional view. He suspected James Hartley had died in his fight with the assailants. His debts and the people he hurt indicated a bad outcome with no traces. Porter. He returned to Illinois in April 1905. He carried James's unfinished letter and a sense of unfinished business. He knew he had to tell Margaret what he found, but how much was unclear. He concluded that she deserved to know the truth, or what he had discovered. Margaret needed to know what happened to her husband, even if it was painful and untrue. Margaret's house hosted a peaceful afternoon meeting. Was alive. Porter brought important papers and the unfinished letter. Reading James's words brought tears to her eyes. They were more complex than tears of grief. They were sadness over the wasted life, anger over the lies and deceit, and possibly one last bit of compassion for James' desperate state. Margaret asked Porter what he thought happened. Sheriff was truthful. He mentioned the men in Vicksburg, that last meeting's tension, and the cruel people who stole James by doing business. He didn't say anything else because she understood. James was probably dead. His body may be on the Mississippi or in the Gulf of Mexico due to strong currents. Their thoughts on this likely outcome were quiet for a while. Margaret finally spoke. Despite crying, her voice was strong. She said she had to. She needed to move on from the past and James' choices. She was still young and had much to live. A scar from the past was always there, but it didn't define her. Despite what happened, a future was possible. Porter admired her strength. He promised to inform her of any new information. He agreed that the case should be dropped for now. His papers stayed. Open, but he would watch what happened but not search as much. Someone else needed assistance or attention. The Hartley story became ordinary in Mechanicsburg in the months that followed. Sometimes people told this story, especially on cold winter nights that reminded them of that terrible January of 1904. Details were added or removed as the story spread, becoming a myth-real hybrid. Margaret survived with determination. More work at the school, community recognition, and forgiveness helped her forget what happened. Newcomers sometimes asked if she was Margaret Hartley from 1904. She'd say she was, but it was a long time ago, then changed the subject. Porter, even after retiring as sheriff, he remembered the case. He organized his files and looked through them on a quiet afternoon, thinking about how complicated people are, as the case had shown, James' decisions, how they affected others, and how identity and truth are easily broken. One last major event occurred in 1907. Body found in mangrove roots near Mississippi mouth in Louisiana, in a state that made. Identifying is nearly impossible. The clothes' wreckage yielded papers and a pocket watch with initials. The local authorities called several sheriff's offices upriver, including Mechanicsburg, to inquire about missing people who fit the description. Porter reviewed the message. The watch's initials matched, and the body's rough description, which was inaccurate because it was breaking down, fit James Hartley's profile. However, there was no certainty. There were few ways to identify people before DNA. Porter kept what he found from Margaret. She had found peace, so it seemed cruel and pointless to bother her with unclear information. All Hartley case participants saw gradual changes over the next few years. Mechanicsburg grew slowly. New families replaced old ones. James and Margaret's farm thrived under new owners. Nobody told them about the place's dark past. Fields resumed work. Fixed barns warmed the house after cold years. Margaret discovered joy she never thought possible during those terrible months on the run. Her teacher, Robert Sullivan, had recently lost his wife. Met in 1908. He moved his 2 grown children from Indiana to Mechanicsburg after his wife's death to start over. Very long ago. Everyone in town knew Margaret's story, but Robert didn't see a tragic woman. Instead, he saw a survivor who rebuilt with honor. Both parties were cautious due to past hurt and disappointment, so the relationship grew slowly. Their discussions about books, teaching, and the world lasted a while. Robert never forced Margaret to talk about James or 1904, but he offered to listen. We required him. Despite everything she had been through, patience and respect won Margaret over like intense passion could never. They married in a small ceremony at Margaret's longtime Baptist church in 1909. The union was welcomed by the community because it allowed them to start over. Margaret married Robert and became a mother figure to his children, who were surprised by their love. Love, not blood, made them family. Choice and need for connection. Porter lives in Mechanicsburg after retiring. He had mixed feelings at the wedding with his wife. He was happy for Margaret, but he couldn't help thinking about James Hartley and how terrible things were because of his choices years ago. Case was never completely over. Though listed as open in county records, it was likely over. James was presumed dead. Margaret. Things moved on, and if this story had justice, it was strange and flawed. The former sheriff rarely contacted police in Mississippi River towns and branches. He heard about finding bodies, missing people, and cases like James Hartley's. Each one was briefly examined by him, but none led to conclusions. The river quietly guarded its secrets. Porter was surprised in 1911. Visitor. In simple, clean clothes, an old man knocked on his door and asked about Hartley. He claimed to be Samuel Dalton, the younger brother of the St. Louis discussed Dalton. Samuel informed him that his brother had recently died and had said some things that troubled him. Confessions about James Hartley contained truths. Porter invited Samuel in and offered coffee while the old man contemplated. Samuel discussed. Truthfully, his brother was a major figure in St. Louis's criminal underworld for years. He oversaw illegal gambling, loans, and other undercover activities. James Hartley got involved in these activities in the late 1890s and incurred huge debts he couldn't repay. When James fled St. Louis, Samuel's brother was furious. Money was important, but so was a good name. Others will break the rules if you let them get away with it. So he sent men to find James. After years, they found him. They tracked him in Illinois and caught him in Vicksburg in early 1905 after his desperate river escapes. Samuel contemplated his words. Porter was calm and patient while the man gathered his courage. Finally, Samuel spoke. The battle at Vicksburg ended differently from his brother's plan. The men were instructed to return James alive to St. Louis to pay off his debts. James resisted. As the fight escalated, the sad ending was inevitable. The men feared. They hadn't anticipated this. In that situation, they could only dispose of the body silently with the river. They returned to St. Louis and sent a coded message to Samuel's brother that James was missing. Words everyone could grasp. Sam's brother was upset. He expected the issue to be resolved, but it wasn't. He had to accept and move on. Porter absorbed this information with an unreadable face. Finally, he asked Samuel why he was telling him this after all these years. The old man said his brother suffered from guilt in his final days. He told Samuel to help those hurt by his actions over the years. Samuel opposed his brother's actions. He respected this dying man's last wish despite their different personalities and life choices. The former sheriff deliberated before acting. Samuel admitted to knowing about the murder, even though he wasn't involved. This would be difficult to prove in court. Men who died and confessed testified about the events in a different state years ago. Porter considered single Margaret, now happily married. He knew reopening the case would hurt her and draw attention. Porter made a controversial decision, but he believed it was right. Instead of doing anything official, he thanked Samuel for coming and took notes on what they discussed. It ended for James Hartley. Though there was no body to bury, that was proven. Margaret preferred peace to a circus of court cases carefully revived. Get over traumas. Justice was not always possible in courts. Samuel appeared relieved and grateful for Porter's kindness. He added one more thing before leaving. A small box of James's belongings from his Vicksburg arrest was found among his brothers. Coins, a pocket knife, and an initialed wedding ring were included. Samuel brought this ring to return it properly. Porter agreed. James Hartley and Margaret Mitchell, her maiden names, are written on the ring. Though small, it was significant. It silently reminded of good faith promises broken by secrets and lies. Porter kept the ring because he didn't know what to do. Giving it to Margaret may rekindle hurts. It felt wrong to keep. He decided to keep it in his personal case files and let fate decide. Over the next few years, Porter. I sometimes looked at that ring and thought about everything it represented. Broken promises and lives, but survival and starting over. Margaret was happy again and had recovered her meaningful life. Though it didn't erase the past, it showed human spirit's strength. Porter reorganized his Hartley case files in 1915. He spent weeks sorting documents by creation date and adding notes to clarify. The goal was to preserve the work, not publish or become famous. He believed that people should remember the story not only for its thrills, but also for its lessons about people, choices, and how things they couldn't control could change their lives. Before anyone could open these files, they had to be kept secret for 50 years. He wanted Margaret and everyone else to live fully before the story was published. Being aware. He stored the papers in the county archives so future historians could find them safely and easily. Porter instructed them to seal the archives, so they did. They secretly guarded a story that shocked a small Illinois town decades earlier. Margaret lived her entire life in Mechanicsburg, where her family and neighbors adored her. She died peacefully at 72 in 1947. Her life was full and meaningful despite her constant scars. Few people at her funeral knew the whole story, and those who did kept quiet out of respect. Robert Sullivan, who lived 3 years longer than his wife, is buried with her in a small cemetery above Mechanicsburg. Their simple but well-kept graves were nearby. Only their names, dates, and a brief message about love and persistence were on the headstones. No one mentioned James Hartley in winter, the fearful and chaotic months of 1904. Margaret buried that phase of her life like any Mississippian. The Porter files, opened in the 1960s, revealed one of Illinois' most intriguing criminal cases. The story's complexity, multiple levels of lies and tragedy, and a woman's journey from darkness to light intrigued historians and researchers. Some wrote academic papers, and others in U.S. crime history books. The Hartley story is remembered again as a retold past story. The fourth generation of the family that bought the farm in 1905 ran it. Although they knew the property's history, it didn't affect their lives. The fields grew crops. The barn held modern tools, and the house had been so remodeled that no physical. Some Hartleys remained. Honest people farmed the land for distant communities. Nothing remained from the past. The Sangamon River flowed through Sangamon County. Its waters marked the seasons and told unfathomable tales. The Mississippi gracefully moved toward the Gulf, ignoring the tragedies along its banks. Rivers keep secret memories for a long time. They break up when they want. Mechanicsburg has grown and changed. Modern highways brought new businesses and residents. Margaret attended a Baptist church that was rebuilt twice, each time larger and more modern. The small sewing school she taught at closed and merged with others to form regional centers. Today, many of those landmarks are gone, but the community remembers the stories. Remember, students studying the case can learn how identity is fragile, how hidden pasts always surface, and how lying can have far-reaching effects. Not that James Hartley was evil. He was a flawed person who made bad decisions until there was no turning back. He nearly killed a good woman by dragging her down. However, Margaret discovered a hidden strength. The story also shows an explanation of justice. James was never tried. Though never found guilty, his actions had harsh and final consequences, even though the judge hadn't told him to. Despite never receiving legal aid or compensation, Margaret started over, found happiness, and died with love. Could this be her justice? Not perfect, but real. Now, Porter's files. Researchers can access digitized records that show case facts and participants. His notes demonstrate that he cared about Margaret, understood James' complexity, and told the truth even when it was hard. He was the best police officer because he balanced duty with kindness and remembered that he was dealing with people, not cases. H. Hartley's case ended, became Illinois folklore. It was repeated in different ways, changing the facts but keeping the emotional core. A couple disappeared in January 1904, leaving questions and a mystery. Some people still talk about that terrible night when the winter wind howled across Mechanicsburg's empty fields. This story shows that even in peaceful places, people can be complicated and bad things can happen. Wedding band that. Samuel Dalton returned to Porter and found a good home. Porter requested that it be placed in the case files with a note explaining its origin before his 1932 death. Many years later, the files were opened, the ring was photographed, and the County Historical Museum received it. It's in a small case in a local criminal history exhibit. Though small, it holds a lot of meaning and memory for those. Over a century, the Hartley case shows us a strangely familiar but different world. The technologies we use have evolved. Previously, weeks-long messages are now sent immediately. Identity fraud is harder. Yet, basic human flaws, like desperation that leads to bad decisions, and the need to survive tough times persist across generations. We think Margaret Hartley Sullivan would say this today. Her tale is not unique. She faced era-specific issues in another time and place. However, the main ideas are universal. Survival, betrayal, renewal. These human experiences transcend time. Her story is important because of its drama, and because it shows how strong the human spirit is, and how things can be fixed after terrible damage. The fields around Mechanicsburg produce a lot of food every fall. Our river, Sangamon. It moves slowly through Illinois' peaceful countryside. Mississippi River always flows to ocean. Life restarts, slowly erasing past events. However, Margaret and James Hartley's story will continue as long as people tell and remember stories. The next generation that listens will learn. One of the most upsetting and difficult cases. This story illustrates that truth isn't always clear. Real life is stranger and more complicated than fiction. Thanks for traveling with us through time, mystery, and tragedy. We await your feedback. Share your thoughts on this case below. What stood out? If these stories interest you, subscribe to the channel. Many more stories need telling. Old, dusty records of former nations hold many mysteries. Like this video if it moved you. Continue reading these stories.